Thank you for joining us for the 79th episode of the Clements Bookworm. I'm Angela Unk, Director of Development at the Clements Library and your host for the morning. Just a couple of quick things in case you're joining us for the first time. We do use the chat and we're happy to have you chime in as well. Just remember to change the setting to everyone so that you're participating in the whole conversation. And because we do use the chat so much, if you have questions, please put those in the Q&A section. And within the Q&A section, you should be able to see other people's questions and give them a thumbs up if you would like to upvote them. That helps us reorder them. So just play around with your settings a little bit. Then the other, oops, I went forward, but we also do have the live transcription turned on, and you can toggle those settings on or off and change the relative size of the text. And this program is brought to you by the William L. Clements Library, located on the campus of the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. The Clements Library's mission is to collect, preserve, share, and promote the study and discussion of primary sources related to all aspects of history and culture of North America and the Caribbean up to about 1900. I would also like to take a moment to acknowledge that the University of Michigan is located on the territory of the Anishinaabe people. In 1817, the Ojibwa, Ottawa, and Potawatomi nations made the largest single land donation to the University of Michigan, offered ceremonially as a gift in the text of the Treaty of the Foot of the Rapids, so that their children could be educated in a Western manner. We acknowledge the history of Native displacement that allowed the University of Michigan to be founded. Today, we reaffirm contemporary and ancestral Anishinaabe ties to this land and their profound contributions to this institution. The William L. Clements Library acknowledges that it has and continues to benefit from the original land dispossession and established hierarchies of settler colonialism. Okay, everybody, if you haven't yet clicked on today's poll question, please do so quickly. We just wanted to get you thinking about the geographic nature of the Revolutionary War before we get started. And I'm going to end the poll and share the results. Okay, there we go. So, like me, many of you debated and tried to decide what the distance really is. And 36% of you got the answer right. It's C, the St. Lawrence River to the West Indies. And so that just gives you a little bit of a thought about the distance that you're considering, and gives you a little base for today's discussion. So thank you for participating. For today's discussion on mapping in the American Revolution, we are joined by two of my Clements colleagues from the Map Division. Mary Sponberg Pedley holds an undergraduate degree in classical studies and earned her PhD in geography from the University of London. Her research centers on map production and commerce in 18th century France and England. Mary co-edited The History of Cartography, Volume 4, Cartography in the European Enlightenment. She has been associated with the Clements Library since 1984 and currently serves as the adjunct curator of maps. Sierra Laddusaw joined the Clements in 2024 as the curator of maps and graphics. Sierra earned her BA from Ouachita Baptist University, an MLS from Texas Women's University, as well as an MS in Geographic Information Science from Northwest Missouri State University. Sierra's prior positions included curator of maps and co-curator of the Chapman, Texas collection at Texas A&M University Cushing Memorial Library, and the scholarly communication librarian at University of Arkansas, Fort Smith. I am so delighted that they are on the program today to give us this wonderful sense of the scope and movement of the revolution. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mary.
Great. Thank you, Angela, and thanks to all of you for coming this morning, and thanks for answering that geographical question to begin with. Just to say that that was the very question that faced people like Thomas Gage and Henry Clinton in conducting the British side of the American Revolution, and George Washington too, because the geographic scope of the revolution was larger than any available maps at the time could really comprehend. And so the biggest challenge for the leaders of both the Patriots and of the British was how to understand spatially the big picture of the wars as it progressed. So we're not going to answer that question for them today, but it's a kind of backdrop against the whole issue of mapping in the American Revolution. And it also gives us a chance to welcome Sierra to the map division. It's been great to have her on board. And you should know from the outset that neither Sierra nor I are military historians. And so we will not be able to entertain any questions on specific battles of the American Revolution. For that, we would have to have the help of some previous map curators, one of whom I'd like to dedicate today's talk. And that, of course, is Brian Dunnigan, map curator from 1996 to 2019, who recently passed away and is much missed by many of us. Brian Dunnigan was an excellent military historian. He really should be giving this talk today, not me and Sierra. But he's one of the shoulders that we stand upon when we're studying maps and mapping in the American Revolution. And he stood on the shoulders of his predecessors, David Bossy, who was the map curator from 1984 to 1995, who wrote a very important article about the main map I'll be talking about today, the Isaac DaCosta map of the town and harbor of Boston. And David Bossy had followed Doug Marshall, who was another military historian who studied the British military engineers of the American Revolution in the 18th century, shown here, looking at a map of the Great Lakes. So to these three map curators, these are the folks we rely on in continuing our research on mapping in the American Revolution. And since it's a bookworm, we need to have some books. And the books, I think, that are the best for understanding maps in the American Revolution were all, with the exception of one, all published for or around the time of the bicentennial, 50 years ago. But these works have not been surpassed by anything else. So this list is available in the chat, so I won't go through it item by item, just to say that this forms a real core that I relied on in preparing this talk, and that we rely on in the map division for knowing anything in detail about any particular map and particular questions about campaigns and battles of the American Revolution. The one exception, of course, is Richard Brown and Paul Cohen's Revolution, published about 10 years ago, which not only includes unusual maps of the American Revolution, but extends backwards quite rightly to the French and Indian War, which was a very important period of mapping for the British in North America. Here's just some images of what those books are like. Most of them are available still on the secondhand market. The Revolution, I think, is still in print So worth looking up. What are the goals for our talks today? Well, one thing I'd like us to be able to do is to think about maps as primary sources, not just illustrations of events. By primary sources, I mean maps were working tools, especially manuscript maps. They weren't created in order to illustrate someone's work afterwards. I also want us to begin thinking how to consider how maps work, whether they're in print or in manuscript. There's a big difference between those two medium. It's obvious, but there's a difference in the goals of maps in print and maps in manuscript. And finally, where Sierra will take over is to introduce you to an outstanding resource for maps of the American Revolution to be found online at a website called Argo. And Sarah will show you how that website works. So we're going to start with probably now a very well-known map of Boston, often referred to as the earliest map of any battle in the American Revolution. It's a plan of the town and harbor of Boston by Isaac DaCosta. And it's remarkable for its detail of the battles at Lexington and Concord by using these figured motifs of actual people, actual weapons, actual movements. I'll put my little pointer on so that you can really focus on how time and space is rendered here in an almost cartoon-like manner, but it makes it very, very vivid that these battles were about people. They're not just rectangles of troops. And so using these figures, you are much more, even with the cannons, the horses, the retreat down to Charlestown, you're much more drawn in to the drama of what happened on April 19th. I put the size on the map on the, as you can see down here, because I think it's really important when you're looking at maps in a PowerPoint or on your screen in a program like this. All maps look the same size. They're the size of whatever your monitor is. This map is not very big. It's only 15 inches high. If you look around your space that you're in right now, look for something that's a little over a foot high and about 1.5 feet wide. So it's a smallish map, and it's a lot of detail packed into a small space. So I'd like to go a little deeper into this map and see what else it tells us. First of all, as with all maps, reading the title. I think the most important part of a map is the title, because that tells you what the author is trying to do. It's a plan of the town harbor of Boston and the country adjacent, with the road from Boston to Concord, showing the place of the late engagement between the king's troops and the provincials, together with several encampments of both armies in or about Boston. And it's taken from an actual survey. This is the kind of imprimatur of this is on the spot. This is fact-based. This is not just something I've made up. And it's humbly inscribed to Richard Whitworth, Esquire, Member of Parliament for Stafford, by his most obedient servant, Isaac I, sometimes misinterpreted as J, but I think we're now convinced it's an I, for Isaac DaCosta. Now, there's some mysteries here immediately, like who the heck is Richard Whitworth? This is not a name that comes up in any book you've ever read about the American Revolution. He's a relatively minor member of Parliament from Staffordshire. He did have an intense interest in North America, but not the Revolution. He was interested in the Northwest Passage, that area in the territories to the west of the Great Lakes, a way to get from the Great Lakes through to the Pacific Ocean. And he wanted an expedition to be led by his two friends, Jonathan Carver and Robert Rogers. You may know Robert Rogers from French and Indian War stories, and Jonathan Carver, who is a bit of a map maker, who comes into the history of representation of North America at about this time. Now, in 1774, the year before this map was printed, Whitworth was expending a lot of energy trying to persuade Parliament to fund his Northwest Passage exploration scheme. And this is where our colleague David Bossy comes in. The Clements Library acquired a small set of Whitworth's papers related to the Northwest Passage in 1985, and much of their contents were published in the American Magazine in 1986. And I hope that comes up in the chat, a link to that magazine. And this is where David Bossy lays out some background of this map and how it fits in to Whitworth's quest for funding for the explanation, even pointing out that there are notes in Whitworth's papers, and I thank Cheney Choperet for getting this photograph to me, that shows that Whitworth's interest in what was happening in Boston is shown in some of these notes. Here's Charleston. Here's perhaps a connection to Montresor, who was one of the engineers who was mapping around Boston. Here's Roxborough, Charlestown set on fire by the bombs from Boston, General Howe, Piggott, 5 pieces of cannon. So you see that some elements in the Whitworth papers that are connected to Boston. Now, who's Isaac DaCosta? Isaac DaCosta was known to both Rogers and Carver. He had served in the French and Indian War at the Battle of Lake George. That's going to become important in a minute. After the end of the French and Indian War, he worked in the naval yards in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and got himself deeply in debt and had to come to London to try to extricate himself from these debts. And there he meets up with Carver, and he's mentioned in a petition by Carver to participate in this expedition to the Northwest Passage. And there's even a letter written in August of 1775 that mentions that Carver and DaCosta have finished a new plan of Boston at the request of Whitworth. So all of this put together suggests that Whitworth has paid for this map's engraving and publication as an effort to raise money for his Northwest Passage expedition. Here in the references that follow underneath the title of the map, we see that this is not only a map of Lexington and Concord, but it also shows the events of 17th of June, 1775. That is the Battle of Bunker Hill, which we can see up here at 12, 13, and 14 in this part of Boston. So it's a map that covers 2 conflicts, Lexington and Concord and the Battle of Bunker Hill, and it's published using Isaac DaCosta, who's in London, as a kind of front man. And it's Isaac DaCosta he's going to be the place where you can buy this map. We know this because at the bottom of the map, we have what's known as the imprint. This is where it has a copyright statement published as the Act directs. It gives the precise date of printing, July 29th, 1775. Now that date is only 6 weeks after the Battle of Bunker Hill. That means it's an incredibly short time for material to arrive from Boston to London to be able to put together a map like this. It's probably one of the fastest time frames of turnaround of most of the printed battle plans during the American Revolution. It also tells us where you could go get this map. You get it at Isaac DaCosta's place on Red Cross Street, Southwark. Southwark is a borough of London that's south of the River Thames. And I'll show you in a minute why this is a real surprise if you're going to sell a map. Southwark is probably not the place you want to be in to sell it from. The other thing we see at the bottom of this map is the engraver's name, C. Hall. Charles Hall was a pretty well-known engraver, not of maps, though he did do some maps, but he mostly did prints of figures, of portraits, or of people in action doing something. We have his trade card, so we know pretty precisely where he lived. And we see some of the flourishes of what a good engraver he was. He was at Mr. Gray's Tailor in Stanhope Street, opposite Hollis Street, Clare Market. And I'll show you on a map of London exactly where that is. Interestingly, the map went through a number of changes, what we call different states, where there were little corrections or additions. And the most surprising change came 6 months later, when the map is now available not from Isaac da Costa anymore, but it's published as the Act Directs on December 16th, 1775, by J. Hand in Oxford Street. J. Hand was a bookseller in Oxford Street, well north of the River Thames, a long way from Southwark. And so this becomes a little interesting bit of the mystery of the da Costa map. So why do I care so much about these addresses for different places in London? It's because if you print a map, you have to sell it. And this map was printed, as we now think, in order to raise money. Now, most map sellers in London were located on a trajectory that goes from the west here at letter A, that's Charing Cross, the bottom of roughly where Trafalgar Square is. This east-west trajectory along the Strand, along Fleet Street, to St. Paul's, to Cheapside, over to the east, and then downwards to this big pile is the Tower of London. And as you get down to L, you're into what was Dockland in the 18th century. This is where all the marine chart sellers were, and it's where all the ship's chandlers were. So from the 1700s right through the 18th century, this was the area where the map trade was. Thomas Jeffries and Faden were here. Andrew Dury was here. Sayer and Bennett were here. Carrington Bowles, and I could go on. Now, I hope you're asking yourself, well, where the heck is Southwark? There. And that's way far away. Notice that there's no bridges to get there until you get here to Tower Bridge. So there's no way to get to Southwark. The engraver was here, Charles Hall, much better location. And when it moves to J. Hand to Oxford Street, you're right over here. And Oxford Street was pretty much a place where a lot of booksellers were, not map sellers very much. So the location of Isaac da Costa was terrible for selling maps. And it was probably reasonable that the plate changes hands may well have been sold. Now, the other mystery to me is the use of those figures for the showing of the battles of Lexington and Concord, because you're never going to see figures again on battle maps of the American Revolution. And I'd be very surprised if any of you can come up with an example of one. And I've been scratching my head trying to think, well, where did Isaac da Costa and Carver get this idea for figures? And then I thought, Lake George. Isaac da Costa had been in the battle at Lake George in 1755, one of the battles of the French and Indian War. There's a very well-known and very dramatic map by Samuel Blodgett called A Perspective View of the Battle Fought over Lake George, published in Boston in 1755. And if we look closely at it, we can see that, again, it's a time and space continuum, using numbers to show when things happen, using figures here, shooting, using images of the cannons, of the encampments, for this surprise attack on Lake George. And I can highly recommend on the Argo website that Sierra is going to show you about, there's a very nice story map about the background of the Blodgett map of St. George. Well, this way of showing a battle was so intriguing for a London map publisher that it was published again by Thomas Jeffreys in London in 1756. Here's a colored version, which makes it even easier to read. And so we do have a kind of model for using images, using figures to show battles. It was taken up briefly again in the same summer as the DaCosta map, 1755 in September, by some map makers called Sayer and Bennett, Richard Sayer and John Bennett, Robert Sayer and John Bennett. And they were right in that main heart of London's land. And they decide, and they also publish maps by Jonathan Carver. So they decide to use this imagery of real people and real things for the Battle of Bunker Hill. Here you can see Charleston in flames, the bombardment, the approach of the English forces, the defense of the American forces, all the same places that were shown on the DaCosta map. And they also use images of the march of the Minutemen towards Boston. Here's the march of General Washington as he moves towards Boston to take up command in July of 1775. However, this kind of using figures, again, doesn't appear anymore. And even Sayer and Bennett, who publish a lot of battle plans of the American Revolution, no longer use this technique of showing people and movement on a map. Instead, we have a standard series of maps of Bunker Hill that use squares and rectangles for troops, use lines for lines of bombardment. And if you look up the series of maps of the action at Bunker Hill, some use, like this one by William Faden, use a flap to show a before and after of the engagement. Andrew Dury's version of it. And if you look up on the Argo website, the Battle of Bunker Hill, you'll find no fewer than 59 different items that come up. So it becomes, the Battle of Bunker Hill, not the Battle of Lexington and Concord, becomes the real icon of the beginning of the American Revolution. And it becomes a very popular map to sell. So this is all about printing. And what does it mean to be a printed map? Well, first and foremost, printed maps, as I've already mentioned, are meant to be sold. And map printing is expensive, and it was specialized, and it was somewhat rare in North America. It occurs, but it's not on the scale that it is in London or in Paris. And the reason for this is because you need a number of things that are essential for printing a good, long-lasting map. You have to begin with, good copper. You have to have copper plate that's prepared from high-quality copper without too much zinc. You don't want it too hard. You want to be able to engrave it. And you have to have it specially refined. You also have to have a workshop of engravers. Whenever an engraver signs a map, like Charles Hall, that's the representation of a whole workshop that Charles Hall would have had working with him. It may not have been as many people as in this workshop, but some of the workshops were very large indeed, filled with apprentices, filled with women, people who had their specialties in engraving maps, some who did certain kinds of lettering, some who just did rivers, some who did just the mountains, the topography. And then you, of course, needed a special press for printing. You needed a roller press that looks like this one, where the copper plate and the damp piece of paper go through these two rollers that press them together. So very specialized. skills and equipment that were somewhat rare in the colonies, and thus printed maps become commercial items. They're designed to be printed in quantity and sold in order to recoup the expenses. Well, just how expensive were they? Here's what it took to engrave and print a map in England in the 18th century. Most of your cost was not in the copper plate, though that was substantial. Most of the cost was taken up in the labor of engraving. Then there were the corrections to be made. Then there was the cost of paper, which of course was considerable because you needed to have good quality paper to print on. The printing itself was pretty minimal because you could print quite a few copies a day on that roller press. So your total cost, say, might be about 50 pounds for printing one map. Well, how much could you sell a map for? You sold a map for about a shilling. Probably the DaCosta map, given its small size and that it wasn't too complex, they probably asked a shilling for it, though I've never seen it advertised and I've never seen a price. That meant that you had to sell at least 2,000 copies of this map or 1,000 copies to make up for the money that you've put in just to printing it. So Mr. Whitworth, hoping to fund his Northwest expedition from any profits from the DaCosta map, was probably a bit optimistic in feeling. And the fact that there are so few of the DaCosta maps around also suggests that perhaps it didn't get printed in a lot of copies, though it could also have been printed in a lot of copies and they got well used. So not only do you have the aspect of printed maps that are the costs of production and how many you have to sell, but you also have to think that behind the map, there are manuscript maps that led to its production. And we happen to have two very interesting manuscript maps that are in the collection of Lord Percy. He's the one here leading the retreat from Lexington, heading back to Charlestown in order to get back to Boston. Lord Percy is a member of the Percy family, who are the part of the Duke of Northumberland's family. And he doesn't go back to England until 1778. And in his papers and in his map collection, now in Northumberland at Alnwick Castle, and I'm just reminding you of the size of this map, is this interesting manuscript map. Now, just to orient you, this is a map in manuscript of roads. And the roads that it shows are between Menotomy here, that's that small town on the way from Cambridge over here, and Charlestown over here, and Medford, which is a little north of them. So north is really over to our left. This is an east-oriented. And you can see from the direction of the writing that this, as a road map, could be used. You'd have to turn it around no matter which way you were going. And on this map, Percy has in fact written that as he was heading towards Cambridge in his retreat, he learned, and he writes this in his own report to General Gage, he learned that the bridge at Cambridge across the Charles River was out, that the Patriots had torn it up. And so he takes this hard left in order to get himself not to Cambridge, but to Charlestown. So this is one map that could possibly be on the basis of the DaCosta map. It's about the same size. This little map of just roads of one small area is about the same size as the DaCosta map is in its entirety. But here's another map, also in manuscript, very fine, fair copy in the Percy papers. And this one has the same layout as the DaCosta map, and it uses the more conventional form of rectangles to show the movement of troops of Lexington and Concord. Here's Percy's return from Lexington. It shows him taking the left here, a little above Menotomy, and heading over to Charlestown that way. And if we superimpose, this map is tiny. It's only 19 centimeters by 31 centimeters. It's about half the size as the DaCosta map. So it's a very small rough draft. If we superimpose that little road map on it, it looks something like this. Nonetheless, what it gives us is a sense of what goes into the construction of a map. You need some of these manuscript maps to begin with, and they are the maps behind the maps. And it also should remind us that manuscript maps are not unique. They are not just one-off copies. Manuscript maps get also done in multiple copies, just not as many as a printed map. And here, for example, from the Clements collection is John Montresor's map, also of July, also 1775, of the same area. This is his own rough draft. It gets copied as a fair copy, really nice copy, that's in the Library of Congress. The copy he makes for General Gage is now at Windsor Castle in the Cumberland collection. The copy that Montresor made for Lord Percy himself is at Alnwick Castle in the Percy collection. And there's yet another copy in the British Library. But just to show you that manuscript maps have their own copy life as well. So who were these people who were the map makers during the Revolution, who were putting together these manuscript maps? And notice that the manuscript maps I just shown you were almost all made for someone. Someone wanted a specific map for a specific thing. So we had a variety of men, and they were men. There were no women in this group, who were the map makers. They were engineers, part of the Corps of Engineers, who were not part of the army. They were under the jurisdiction of the Board of Ordnance. They go back a long way to the late 17th century. Map makers who were in the army were called assistant engineers. They were military officers. You also had enlisted men or veterans who had a talent for mapping, like the Loyalist Corps of Guides and Pioneers. You needed draftsmen. Those were the people who actually copied the maps again and again, who were trained in the Tower of London by the Board of Ordnance. They too were not in the army, but were associated with the army. Foreign officers, there were a lot of foreign officers, largely Germans and French, who were participating in the American Revolution. The Hessians, of course, on the side of the British, the French under General Rochambeau, American, but even his army was made up of a lot of German officers, all of whom had been trained on the continent. Local surveyors were pulled in. And in fact, I would say, as I've always said about maps, anyone can make a map and anyone can do it. None of these people, except for the Corps of Engineers, perhaps had specialized training in any formal school way. They'd either been trained on the spot by a parent, by someone older, someone who showed them what to do. And what they had in common was a spatial awareness, drawing ability, and mathematical competence. They could look at a book. They could look at a book like this, the L'Art de lever les plans by Dupin de Montesson, very famous and popular book about a kind of how-to guide to make a survey, how to use a compass, how to use a plane table, how to use the sighting view, the theodolite that's going to measure the angles, how to measure on the ground, either with pole or with chain, and also the use of this device, which is holding up a reflector so that if you were looking for, if you were in a countryside that didn't have a church spire or some high object, you could spot with your telescope that white reflection and then mark your angles more easily. And we see this, in fact, on maps themselves, the little drawings where you see surveyors at work with their plane table, tripod, with their reflectors. Even surveyors of property here in Georgia who are using the chain to mark things out and who have a theodolite, an angle measurer here to measure the corner of the property. And similarly, we have the surveyor, in this case, JFW DeBar, who created the very important set of charts called the Atlantic Neptune, doing his survey work in the middle of the Gulf of Canso up near Nova Scotia. So what kind of maps did the leaders of either the British side or the American side, because there was no difference in mapping or surveying techniques of either side, what kind of maps did they want and did they need? First and foremost, they needed roads and routes. And it could be as simple as this one. This is Clinton 290, which are roads in North Carolina. And I'll just show you a detail so you can see what's being shown here. First of all, our map maker, who's anonymous, tells us the names of where this road has bridges. And all the bridges are specified and laid out. It also tells you where there are ferries along the road. And if there are no bridges and no ferries, it tells you that the rest of the road is fordable across the creeks and rivers. So as you're going along here, you have not only mileages, but you also are told you can compare these names with what's over here to know what you need to be aware of and how you're going to plan your route in terms of how you're going to get across any of the rivers and creeks you come to. A more formal copy of a map of routes and rivers is this made by Montresor, who's laying out the route for troops moving from here, the heights across the river, across the Hudson River, and to go into New Jersey. And he does it along this way. And he also lists who's where along this route. He breaks down what the different units are of the Army. And this helps us to understand that when you're preparing a route map, you're preparing it for thousands of people, not just for travelers. You're moving troops in large numbers, and you needed to be organized about it. This next kind of map that was called for by the generals, of course, were topographic maps. What was the lie of the land? And you get very rough sketches like this one by Abraham Close. It's just a rough sketch of roads, and the topography is shown very sketchily here. Or in this map of the environs of Brooklyn, there's the tip end of New York. This is the western edge, of course, of Long Island. You can see that the topography has been done much more carefully in terms of this hatchering, this use of the close lines and shading. And the next kind of map you needed was reconnaissance maps, maps that showed you where the enemy was. And that could include maps like this one in South Carolina of Cherokee territory, making sure that you weren't entirely clear who the local Native Americans were aligned with, but you needed to know where they were. Here, the mountains are only shown as the words mountains, but the connection between the rivers becomes very important, and the place names of different groups of people and where they might be lays out the reconnaissance of those folks who could be either with you or not with you. Similarly, here's a map done by one of the Hessian officers, Reinhard Martin, that shows Washington's position at Morristown in New Jersey. And here's where you absolutely want to know where General Washington is. Here's his house, the general's guards, and whoops, and here's the patriot militias that are nearby. The final kinds of things that you needed are views. So I'm taking us back to the Boston of 1775, where we began, to show you two sets of views that give you another perspective on that Battle of Bunker Hill. This map, which is a view of Charleston and the landing point, I'll just go back and show you, that would be from right along here, has General Clinton's writing up here in the top, where he shows the landing place of the British troops, the covering fire from the ships. He even specifies here at sea as my landing place. Here's where the rebels were. So this is very much from his own point of view. And here are the ruins of Charleston, nothing but chimneys. The rest of the house has been burned in each situation. So Charlestown ruined. And similarly, we have a perspective view, this one from Beacon Hill, showing the rebel encampments across the river. And we look here, as we look in, we can see that there's that River Charles where that bridge was that caused Percy to take that left turn. Cambridge over here, Little Cambridge here, rebel enclave there. So the view is another aspect of map making that was very important, especially in an age where there was no photography and no other way to express what you saw. So that just little introduction, which gives you the sense of what printed maps can do, what manuscript maps can do, leads us into learning more about Argo, which is a resource that Sierra will introduce us to. Thus, printed maps, especially of battles, were for public distribution, usually sold. They broadcast news visually. The plate belongs to the publisher. Manuscript maps, private distribution, specific information about space, not designed for permanence, and the map belonged to the map maker. So all these and more as I turn it over to Argo. Thank you.
All right, so you saw this kind of title page for Argo early in Mary's presentation. And I wanted to, for probably many of you, introduce you to this platform. If you're familiar with it, though, I wanted to show you some ways to help navigate it and some of the really interesting features that exist in it. So Argo is an acronym, and it stands for American Revolutionary Geographies Online. This is a project that's a partnership between the George Washington Presidential Library and the Norman B. Leventhal Map and Education Center, who are located at the Boston Public Library. This is for a very specific topic, the Revolution, working to become that kind of one-stop shop where you sometimes go online and wish you could search one portal and see all the things related to it rather than having to go out to 15 different libraries' digital collections. This project launched online in November of 2022. The Clements Library was a partner from the start on this, and you will find many of our maps represented in the collection. Today, there's over 4,000 maps of North America, all made between 1750 and 1800 from 16 different institutions represented in this platform. There are 13 new partners who are joining on, which is really exciting. So you'll be seeing even more maps being added to this. Something to know about the partner collections is it is people you would definitely expect to see. So it's, Boston Public Library, it's the Clements Library, but there's also international libraries who hold maps in their collections who are a part of this project. So I thought I'd start by giving you a quick rundown of this landing page, and then we'll delve a little deeper into the platform. So across the top is kind of your anchored heading. with different buttons that'll take you to different parts of the projects. So the stories page is where different professionals, whether they're historians or they are map makers or they're librarians and curators, have actually worked to develop different interpretive content around the maps. Something exciting that you'll notice is the newest piece added to this page is our current exhibit, Bloody Work. And when you click into it, it will link out to our digital exhibit, but it'll also show the two different versions of the DaCosta map that are in Argo, allowing you to compare the one in the Clements collection to the one at the Library of Congress. Just from these little snapshots of the map here, you can immediately tell that the Library of Congress's version has had color added to it, specifically in the environments in Boston for the footprints of the town. But you can also see the discoloration of the Library of Congress's map in comparison to the one we have here at the Clements. I'm going to pop back into the stories. And as we scroll through, you'll notice there are things like exhibits. So this is the Leventhal's current exhibit for the Revolutionary War. But you're also going to get things like articles that have been written by historians. This is the one Mary mentioned about the Battle of Lake George and that really iconic map with all of the little pictures on it. There's also recordings of lectures that have been given at different events too. This is a really great place if you want to learn more about an individual map or an individual moment during the Revolution. The themes page is where partners in the project have tried to group things together so that you can come in and start having kind of a browsable experience. So if you're interested in who all was present in North America between 1750 and 1800, this Empires and Nations page is a great place to start. Features is going to allow you to browse maps by decorative cartouches, different pictures that might appear on a map, illustrations of boats, illustrations of mountains. If you only want to see hand-colored maps, this is a place to come and look. And so as you scroll through, you'll notice some other pieces like this. I really like the language page because when we think about the American Revolution, we think that we're going to see things in English, we're going to see some things in French, we might see some things in Spanish. But what you're going to see here is there are maps from this time period of North America printed in Japanese, printed in Armenian. It's a really interesting way to look at how different parts of the world were mapping and reporting on the revolution. The people page is about the people who made these maps. So each of these pages in here are going to focus on different creators, whether they're the engraver, the maps cartographer, somebody who did lettering, somebody who did coloring. It's a really nice place to come and look and learn about different ones. And you'll notice just from this landing on the page immediately that this is not all just men and not just all white men. The first tab here for Benjamin, he was an African-American surveyor. There's a number of women represented on this page too, and it really highlights the amount of labor that went into producing a map by women. The partner collections page will show you all the libraries that currently have maps in the collection. You'll notice we're the first one listed. But as we go through, you're going to see things like the British Library, but also the Maclean collection. So we're getting big national libraries, we're getting university libraries, we're also getting historical societies, and some of those more private collections that are still open to public research. If you're curious about those 13 partners that are joining, there's this link here to the future partners, which will list them out. And it gives some anticipative dates of when their maps will start appearing in the collection. So there's some big players coming in, like the Osher Map Library and the John Carter Brown. And then you'll also notice that we also have some major national libraries out of France and Quebec. So I'm going to pop back to the front page. What you're first greeted with is a search bar, and we'll come back to that in just a second. It does scroll for a while, and it'll go through those top buttons again, just showing you whatever the three most recent additions are. But then it has this really excellent timeline. And so this starts before the war and then moves to just after. And as you scroll through the timeline, you can click on any of these buttons and they'll expand more to tell you about what's happening at that point in time. And many of them will have maps tied to it too. So if I come in here, it'll actually take me out to 3 maps specifically related to the 1745 siege of Louisburg. You can also explore the collection geographically. So they have this map here. which you'll notice at the bottom does tell you not every map in the collection appears. But each of these blue squares on the map is basically the bounding of a map of that area. And if I click in this section, it's going to show me the 12 maps that have been highlighted in orange. If I'm interested in seeing maybe only maps of cities, I can toggle it over and you'll see it changes to these smaller footprints. You can click in again and see those and then bump out to each map individually. And then we're back into some of those feature exploration options. So there was the search bar when you first land on the page. There's also the blue search button at the top. Something you're going to notice if you're familiar with searching digital collections or a library database is there's not an advanced search option. You're only going to get this one search bar. But what you can do in this search bar is use your and or not functions, which is going to let you merge words together to say, I only want to see maps of Boston that also has cannons. That would be Boston and cannons. I only want to see maps of Boston that don't have cannons, so Boston's not cannons. You can also put things in quotations to force it to search for that as a phrase rather than individual words. So let's go ahead and just search Boston since we've been talking about that today. You'll see there's almost 1,300 different maps that pop up. And what's really nice is if a map exists in multiple states at one collection or in multiple states across multiple collections, each state is going to be represented in here, allowing you to compare those maps. Even if it's from the same printing of the map, that map may have had different use during its lifetime. So you're going to see the evidence of that wear and tear. You might see manuscript annotations. You might see what the library's added to it in their accessioning process over the years. So it's really nice to be able to see multiple versions of the same map. If I add in Boston and cannons, it's going to take me down to a much smaller search here with only 9 results. And we're going to go into a plan of the town of Boston that's at the Leventhal collection. And when we enter into a maps page, your map might start blurry at first, but as it's fully loaded in all of what they call tiles, you'll get a deep zoom feature where you're able to really get in close on that map and see those tiny words, look at the individual features, look at how the cartographer put that map together. And when you scroll down, you're going to get some metadata, which is basically going to be the information telling you what we know about this map. But if you're noticing, nowhere on this page does it say the word cannons. And when that first happened for me, I was like, what's going on? Why did this come up in my search? If I go out to the object, so each item in here also will have a link out to its holding at the individual institution. So now I'm directly on the Leventhal's page for this map. And you'll see in the metadata here, there's a very long description that does not appear in the Argo website. But in here is where it talks about the cannons. So Argo still has that metadata in the background and is searching the entirety of it, even though they're only displaying a limited piece. Some of them you'll see will have a download link on the page. Others will require you to go to the institution to download directly from them. And this is because Argo itself is being hosted out of the Leventhal Library. And so this map is a Leventhal map. It's sitting on their infrastructure. Maps being served out of, say, our collection at the Clements Library aren't actually living digitally on a server at the Leventhal Library. They are being essentially harvested through a IIIF instance. IIIF is International Image Interoperability Framework, which is a big acronym to simply say we have pretty much internationally come up with a standard for serving digital objects and their metadata. And using that standard allows other libraries to pull from your page to display those items. This is great because if we make a change to our metadata, or say we're rescanning our gauge maps right now and we're going to replace images, we don't have to send anything to the Leventhal Library to have them updated on their end. Because it's pointing at our server, it's going to automatically update in Argo when we update our instance. So it's less work all around. Another fun thing down here is in this georeferencing section. You can view a map on here that's already been georeferenced. And it's going to open in something called the All Maps viewer. All Maps is another product out of the Leventhal Center. And it's really kind of this next huge step in georeferencing. Historically, when you were georeferencing, which is simply putting real world coordinates on the map so that it'll tie to those spots when you display it, you had to do it in a full geographic information system. And this was something that typically required you to have a very expensive computer to run that system, but also to pay for expensive software. All Maps is a way we can now do it in our web browser in a really quick and easy, pretty user-friendly click and play interface. And so you'll see this map is now appearing over the modern map of Boston, and you can scroll in on it. You can adjust the opacity if you want to of the map itself, or of kind of removing that background of the map so you can see the historic data on top of the modern data. So I'm going to go into partner collections to go into the Clements collections here so you can see what we have from the Clements Library appearing in here. It has a quick little blurb about who we are and what the map division holds, and links out to our map division page. And as you scroll through, you're going to see quite a few maps that are showing up. And what I'm doing right now is actually scrolling and looking for a small scale map to show you how to do a georeferencing. By picking a small scale map, that means I'm picking a map that's showing a larger amount of land. It'll be an easier georeference to do on the fly live. So let's see. Here, the Great Lakes. Let's see. So I've pulled up this map here. I'm showing the Great Lakes. I'm going to scroll down and you'll notice there doesn't say see this georeferenced map. It only has georeferenced this map. When you open that, it's going to load the All Maps interface, and you're first going to be presented with the image to make sure it's something you actually want to work with. Your next step is to click Draw Mask. What we're going to do is draw a box only around that cartographic data. So you'll see outside of the neat line, we have a really large margin on this map. And that's not anything that has any sort of spatial information. So it's not necessary to have when we're doing our georeferencing. I'm simply going to drop points by clicking on my corners within the neat line. And when I get to my last one, I can double click to finish my box. Looks pretty good. So now I'm going to click to georeference. When you are georeferencing, you're wanting to apply at least 4 points. You can do more, but there is a point where you've added too much and your data is going to start getting funky with too many errors. So on the map of today's world, I'm going to zoom in on my Great Lakes. I'm going to zoom in over here also, and I'm going to start looking for some spots that I could say, I feel confident that's the same location. I'm going to come out to the edge of Lake Superior and add a point, and I'm going to do the same thing on the modern map. And you don't want your points to be clustered, because then all of the data is going to be in one little portion of your map, and it's going to start really doing some strange skewing of what the map looks like in the end. Let me pull over, and we're going to come here to where Lake Ontario and Lake Erie are sort of meeting on this map. I'll zoom in a little over here and give it in the same general location. Let's come down to the bottom tip of Michigan. And then maybe this top point of Lake Superior. So I've applied 4 points now. In this little box that's at the bottom of the screen, this 1, 2 with lines will open and show you the coordinates you've applied to those points. You could, if you really wanted to get into things, change the way it's going to do the morphing of the map, but we'll just leave it as a polynomial. And if I go into my results, it'll show me what that's looking like laid over the map. So you'll notice we're getting a little bit of a kind of bubbling skewing on that left portion of the map, and this is being caused by not having a point in that general region. So we could go back and add it, but at this point, I'm going to stop here. As you're doing your work, it's automatically being saved. So you can just exit, go back to your map, refresh, and you'll see that you can now view this georeferenced map. If you just watch this and you were just like, she didn't finish it, that was horrible, you could come back to this page and hit improve and add those additional points. You could delete a point I put in if you felt it wasn't accurate enough. And this is a really fun way to help enhance this project. And I haven't actually talked to the folks at the Leventhal about that map we saw on the home page, but I anticipate these boxes are being driven by the maps that have been georeferenced in the project. So doing that georeferencing will put more of the maps into this geographic search interface. And so with that, I'm going to stop sharing. I really encourage you to go explore Argo. It's a fabulous, fabulous tool that is growing every year. I'm part of the Leventhal, and we do a lot of work to try to get people to, one, use the tool. Something I forgot to mention is it has a really great piece down at all the way at the bottom of that landing page, where if you are a K through 12 educator, where there are proposed lessons plans on how you could teach with the maps in this digital collection, that are easy for you to bring up on the screen in your classroom to show the maps to your students, and walk them through map making, how maps were important in the Revolutionary War. And so it's just a really great tool, and I really encourage you to go explore it.
Thank you. That was amazing. And I am going to share my screen and make a couple of announcements before we continue with questions. If you do have questions, please put them in the Q&A section. And I will also mention, as some of you heard at the very beginning, that I was without power at home. So I came in to the Clements to do the Bookworm. And I know Isaac's on the program. And Isaac, if you could bring me a power cable for my computer, I did not think of that when I came here. All right, so that's where we are. And now I need to share, which I clicked and somehow lost. Please hold while I find that. Oops. Cancel. What did I click? Okay, well, I can do it without slides. So I will tell you all that continuing with our Revolutionary War information, and Mary talked about the DaCosta map, we have our current exhibit, which is Bloody Work, Lexington and Concord, 1775. And that explores the early months of 1775 in Massachusetts, the battles of April 19th and their immediate aftermath. It's available online, and you can also come see it in person from noon to 4, Monday through Friday. And we do have some dates coming up of tours at the Clements as well. So if you'll be in town and would like a guided tour, we'd love to see you. To celebrate the 102nd birthday of the Clements Library, we have an ice cream social coming up on June 11th from 4 to 6 p.m. on the South Plaza as we celebrate that birthday. The exhibit will also be open late that day, so you'll be able to view the exhibit as well from 4 to 6 p.m. Next month, so you're already signed up for the Bookworm, you'll receive a reminder about next month's program, and you can choose to watch it live, or you'll get a recording just like today with all of the resources later in the afternoon. Next month, we'll be talking with author Susanna Ashton about her book, A Plausible Man, the true story of the escaped slave who inspired Uncle Tom's Cabin, the remarkable story of the man behind the book that helped spark the Civil War in a stunning historical detective story. So that is going to be great. If you're interested in sponsoring a future episode of the Bookworm, please let me or Anne know. We're always happy to have you. And I will just mention, in case we have anyone on the program from California, I know I saw Roger Genser had joined us, and I've already been talking with him about this event, but Sierra and Paul Erickson and I will all be in California next week for an event at Barry Ruderman's antique map shop. And so if anyone on the program, if we don't know that you're in California, if you're traveling to California and you want to join us, send me an email and we'd be happy to see you. Okay, And with that, we can get on to questions, but I am also going to plug in my computer. So I noticed that a lot of the questions revolve around people are really thinking about what exactly is the public doing with these maps. And so I think one of the best ones to start with maybe is, who was the audience for those printed maps?
Well, the audience was multifold, and there's been, it's also kind of hard to pin down. It's like, who was the audience for books in the 18th century? Maps were another printed resource, like prints themselves. The best way we know specifically about who the consumers were is through subscription lists. Sometimes a map was produced like a book and needed money up front before production began. And what you did then was you offered that map for subscription. So let's say Isaac DaCosta and his sponsor Whitworth had wanted to get subscribers for the DaCosta map, and they would ask for money up front. They'd probably offer a bit of a discount. If you subscribe now, you get a 2-for-1. And often those subscribers are printed on maps themselves or printed in a separate publication. And analysis of subscription lists then tell us a lot. And it's kind of surprising. There's a lot of sort of upper class types who are subscribers. There's a lot of quite ordinary people who subscribe for maps. You get a much more sense of gender distribution. Get women who subscribe for maps. I did a study on the subscription list for an atlas, a French atlas published in 1757 called the Atlas Universel by Robert de Bougainville. And I was also surprised how many other booksellers and map sellers were also subscribers for the item. You get people who subscribe for multiple copies. For example, there's a series of maps published of the island of Haiti, Saint-Domingue, in the 1790s, for which the king himself, King Louis XVI, subscribes for over 100 copies himself, no doubt for distribution throughout the government. So subscription lists tell us a lot. A lot of times people don't pay any attention to the subscription list, and there's still a lot of work to be done on that analysis and helping us understand who the consumers were. But the other way you find out about consumers is what people record in their diaries, their journals, the books that they write, in which they might mention that they've consulted maps of places. And people have included that in their own analysis of the map trade. So kind of a long answer to.
And I'll add too, and you think about kind of the everyman when we look at prints from this time that are views inside of shops and homes and schools and churches, you're often going to see a framed map on the wall. So this is your current information and how you're keeping up with the happenings of the world. And then I'll also quickly share my screen to show kind of a fun like carto curiosity. And so this map here, it might be hard to tell in this sharing, is printed on fabric. And so what we have here is a Revolutionary War era map, a map of the present seat of war in North America. Unclear if this was printed for an American or a British audience. Probably done that way purposefully so it could sell to a wider net of people. But it is, in the upper corner, you'll see, gives you an index to a series of battles that took place on Long Island in 1776. And then it also has this curious chart, which is the population of the British colonies, men, white and black, able to bear arms. And so here you're getting some information about who is living in the colonies and the population totals within. But this is something that would have been to a consumer audience and not for military use, being printed on this sort of handkerchief piece. And this is actually much larger than the DaCosta map and really sweet. if you zoom in, you'll see there's an old repair to a hole that formed in the middle, right on top of General Wolfe's obelisk in New York. So you'll also have these sorts of things that are being produced. You'll see maps appearing on plates and mugs. They're going to show up in all sorts of these sort of consumer goods. The same way today we would get that sort of information delivered to us by the news. This is some of that news source, and it becomes part of your popular culture also.
Good points.
All right, so continuing with printed maps, Tom asked an interesting question. He's wondering if those perspective view maps were more understandable by civilians than the aerial plan maps. And I don't know if either of you have had a chance to think about that.
I think about it in terms of Google Maps today. A lot of people are quite comfortable with the view looking, the orthogonal view that looks straight down. But a lot of people like street view. And the minute you can click and see the same thing from your perspective on the ground, it can make more sense to you. So I think for the military engineer, for the map maker, it was good to be versatile in both, because what they're doing is taking the street view level and through a mathematical combination, they're converting that to an orthogonal view, which absolutely can be hard to read. I don't think it's a civilian or military thing. I think it's a personal thing. I mean, I know people who simply can't read maps, can't make out what you do with these lines and dots and their arrangement. So I think being skilled at both was extremely important. And drawing was taught at the Royal Military Academy from its inception. In fact, in all military academies throughout Europe, drawing was an essential part of map making.
Right. I was just waiting to make sure that Sierra didn't have anything to add. So that's, yeah, I like that connection to what we're used to today with Google Maps. Thank you. And then Ronald is going back to this idea of how quickly or slowly the maps might be made. And you mentioned how fast that DaCosta map came out.
Right.
But with those troop locations, you know, he's just thinking a little bit more about that. And in terms of the troops moving all the time. And it seems like if you printed those, they would have a very short life.
Well, that's a really good question, because it brings up the essential problem of the battle map that I didn't have time to go into in the talk. But battle maps were of almost no use to the conductors to the generals in the revolution. They looked backwards. And all the manuscript maps I showed you in my quick summary of manuscript maps are all prospective. They're looking forwards. They're looking forwards at things, because the understanding is the one thing a map cannot show very well is time. The time and space problem. Maps are to do with space. These troops are to do with time. So the battle maps really become the object that map publishers love to sell, because they're historical like that. They're just a historical illustration of something that happened. They don't have much strategic significance at all, and you don't see. And if you tend to see battle maps in manuscript, it's because the officer making that map. And this is something that Doug Marshall really brought forward in his work on British military engineers. The way you got yourself promoted as an officer was to draw attention to yourself. And one way to do that was to present a really beautiful map to a commanding officer, to a person in power, dedicate it, do a beautiful cartouche around it. And spending energy on those kind of battle maps that were beautifully presented took you away from doing the essential kind of topographical reconnaissance or route mapping. Since the map belonged to you, the map maker, you also could send that map to a London publisher or an American publisher for that matter, and ask them to publish it, pay for the publication, get the profits from the sale of that map. So the battle map performs this completely different function than all the other manuscript maps we were looking at. And that may help understand why the problem of time becomes less important, though it was one they struggled with. Remember that flap on the Faden map? William Faden loves to do flaps on his map. Sort of, this was day one, this was day, take the flap off, you've got day two. I think our map of the Battle of Yorktown does the same kind of thing. When you've got a siege going on and different things happen at different times, that's the best way you can do it. The other way is by numbers. Position 1, position 2, position 3, and that now with georeferencing and story maps, you could probably break that all down and have movement on the map as you go along, but maps themselves are static.
Yeah, I didn't say that. The one kind of exemplary and quite heralded example of a map that does time and geography well is Menard's map of the march into Russia.
Oh, yes,
you
yes,
see
yes.
all the troops go in, and then
Right.
as they're piddling down because they weren't prepared for the
Right.
weather and the rivers and the lack of
Yeah.
food and the bad shoes, his
Right.
return with a much smaller military.
That's right. And using that breadth of the arrow of the size of the troops that then diminishes as it comes back. So those are really important thematic maps.
So you mentioned manuscript maps as you were talking about this, and Tom wondered if since they're military maps, were they secret? And, you know, because they're perspective?
Yeah, not particularly. I mean, yeah, I mean, all maps are secret if they're to do with, as you say, as I said, perspective view of possible plans. But also the map making world is kind of porous. I mean, it's not who will guard the guards. I mean, you own a map, a manuscript map is going to be copied, keeping track of how many copies there are, who's got copies, having, you know, famous spy maps with John Andre and Benedict Arnold are perhaps examples. But I find the categorization of spy maps and secret maps at this point and in this kind of conflict, where you have to remember that the Patriot engineers and the British engineers, many of them had served on the same side in the French and Indian War and received their training there. So there's nothing particularly special in their different training or representation. And there's no mechanism for really keeping maps secret. You can just try to be discreet. It's a bit like Gage's plans for Lexington and Concord. And was there a spy who revealed the plans to Paul Revere, to Dr. Warren beforehand? Probably not. Probably just people noticed that, gosh, there's a lot of movement of troops along the road. And you know, it's hard to keep these things secret when 500 men all in their full uniform start marching out of Boston to go somewhere. And nor was it hard to keep secret the buildup of the Patriots and stockpiling of their arms and weapons. So
yes, I think that's good. So David Bossy enjoyed the information on the map trade and the connection with the Battle of Lake George, and wonders if there was a connection between Whitworth and Percy.
That's a good question. I don't know. Cheney and I will probably have a good look in the Whitworth papers, and I don't know whether there are other Whitworth papers. And somehow Whitworth did get this information that I showed the little picture of jotted down about what was going on in Boston. So he knew someone there. But very good question, and nice to hear from David. And
indeed. All right. And Charlene is wondering, is there a website similar to Argo that features Civil War maps?
Ooh,
I am not aware of one. I think it's one still where the Library of Congress has a great page for their collections. And I think it's still somewhat more scattered. Um, Argo was a grant-funded project from over several grants. And so it's the sort of thing that would need to have a hosting institution or more than one who were interested in kind of bringing them together. And so when you look at the formation of Argo, it kind of makes sense as a partnership between the George Washington Library and the Leventhal Center. The core of the Leventhal maps are really these fantastic Revolutionary War maps focusing on Boston. So I think it's the sort of project that should exist, but it's the sort of project that would also need the extensive funding and expertise tied to it that has been tied to Argo. There are some nice story maps out there where people have picked a map from this collection and that collection to tell a story about something during the Civil War, but kind of a broad Civil War portal. I'm not aware of one.
Yes, so hopefully someday there will be grant funding available for such a thing. That would be amazing. Yeah, because I have to tell you all, even though I knew the Argo project existed and I had opened the webpage very early on, until Sierra walked through it during our dress rehearsal, I didn't fully understand the depth and breadth. So I hope you all spend the rest of the day playing around with it because it's pretty fantastic. All right, it looks like that's all of our questions. And I'm so happy to have had you both on the program and learn so much about the maps from the Revolutionary War. And thank you for everyone who joined us and asked such good questions as well. And we'll hopefully see you next month.
thank you.
Bye, everyone.